Hi everyone, and welcome to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council webinar, Achieving Sustainable Growth Through Environmental Intelligence, from Reactive Management to Actionable Insights. My name is Kerry Griffiths and I'm the Technical Director with the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I lead the technical work program within the IS Council along with my team, and we are committed to working with industry and key stakeholders to drive continuous improvement across our rating scheme. I'm really excited to be joining you today for this session, which I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot from. I just want to first begin our session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today. I and the IS Council acknowledge their deep connection to land, water and culture, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm joining you today from Te Whanganui Atara, Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Deep connection to land, water and culture sets the frame for our conversation today on the topic of environmental intelligence. How can we capture better data to inform better decisions to deliver environmental, cultural, social and economic benefits? We're joined today by Ben Rippingale from Envirosuite and Ivan Fernandez from Frost & Sullivan. I'll get Ben and Ivan to introduce themselves shortly. They're going to be sharing with us some of the insights from a report that Envirosuite and Frost & Sullivan published on environmental intelligence, driving growth in a changing climate. They'll be sharing information and insights from that study and report during our session today. So let me hand over Ben just to give a brief introduction to the participants here today at our webinar.
Thanks very much, Kerry. My name is Ben Rippingale. I'm the Senior Environmental Intelligence Advisor for Envirosuite for APAC. I'm a strategist by formal training and have spent most of my career working in the spatial intelligence industries for operational intelligence systems across GIS, building information and systems, and as well as geospatial imagery and remote sensing from satellite imagery. So very honoured to be here and invited in to be speaking today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben. And Ivan, just a brief overview from you.
Thanks, Kerry. Ivan Fernandez from Frost & Sullivan in the Sydney office. We're an industry research and consulting firm, 40 offices across the globe. I've been with the company 20 years.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ivan. Let me just give a brief outline of how we're going to run our session today. We're going to have a conversation really with myself and Ben and Ivan on environmental intelligence over the next 30 minutes or so. What it is and the values and benefits that it can deliver. We have allowed time at the end for questions, so please do pop those into the Q&A as we go throughout the session. Anything that comes up for you, feel free to put it in there and I'll draw those questions out at the end. We've also got a couple of polls as we go through, so I'd encourage you all to participate in those. But let's get started. And Ivan, kick off with you and just really, what do we mean by environmental intelligence? What is it actually?
Yeah, Kerry. So when we talk of environmental intelligence, we're really talking about going beyond mere data collection as a focus of conventional environmental monitoring to more intelligent acquiring and applying of environmental knowledge using and leveraging digital solutions. So it's really about moving from way beyond the basic reactive firefighting kind of approach to environmental impacts to a more proactive strategic use of environmental and operational data. I think that's the key, right? It's not just environmental data in isolation, but really looking at that in the context of what's happening in the operations.
Brilliant. Ben, would you like to add to that?
Well, look, my main perspective comes from what our clients tend to find and how they tend to identify what environmental intelligence is for them. They're finding it's a fundamental way that they change how they change the way that they work with their environmental responsibilities and environmental data. And as Ivan mentioned earlier, traditionally that has meant being heavily reactive. It's been management by exception, and it's been focusing on a lot of the symptoms rather than the causes. So when complaints grow very loud, or worst case, a regulator gets involved and is threatening to impose operational restrictions or something, those organisations used to scramble for a quick fix, which more often than not was informed by a lot of gut feel and putting the most oil on the squeakiest wheels. And this approach, of course, delivers very mixed results. And when they do work, it's generally overkill with a pretty hefty ongoing cost associated with it. So EI for our clients, it's a totally different headset. It's all about informed planning and getting ahead of the curve so that potential problems are either effectively mitigated or preferably avoided altogether. When you're working with EI, you've got a learning model of how your specific operational activities for your sites are going to interact with the surrounding environment under any given conditions, regardless of the wind, the weather, temperature, humidity, a whole range of different environmental factors, as well as your own operational data, what you're actually doing on the ground at the time. So once you've got that and you understand how those different factors interact with each other, you're able to plan the shift, the day, the week, to make sure that you're operating in a way that's that's optimal. It basically moves environmental management from being a cost centre to a proactive operational tool that decreases risks and ultimately saves the business money.
Great, and it's certainly within our organisation an area that we have a strong interest in, as we as our listeners and participants here today will know. You know, we have a strong focus around how do you measuring what matters, I guess. If you're trying to drive improvements, how do you track that in a more efficient and effective way? And the whole kind of opportunities that are delivered through kind of digitalisation around in this space, putting less time and effort needing to be taken up with actually putting those systems and monitoring systems in place, and more focus on what are the things we can do to improve the outcome. So it's certainly an agenda that at a strategic level, the IS Council is very interested in learning more about and engaging more with, and hoping that our projects will be doing the same. You've mentioned a little bit, I guess, Ben, around that in terms of why EI is important, but Ivan, do you have anything to add to the kind of importance story?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the scale of the problem, right? So when we did the study, we polled 272 executives across the globe, airports, cities, mines, construction, water, wastewater, the whole range. And more than half of our respondents admitted that they have experienced dramatic or significant impacts on their organization on account of environmental factors. So if you take any of the parameters we're talking of, just take air quality. We saw what happened during the Black Summer bushfires, right? They say actually 437,000 people were exposed to poor or worse air quality index levels during the fires. And modeling showed that 171 deaths were brought forward due to exposure to particulate matter that was harmful. You take noise. Now, under current occupational noise exposure levels in Australia, over 80,000 male workers and over 31,000 female workers will develop occupational noise-induced hearing loss over 10 years of exposure. And that translates into a projected loss of $5.5 billion due to well-being losses and $21.3 billion due to productivity losses. Or you take weather. The cost of extreme weather disasters in Australia has more than doubled since the 1970s. So it's reached something in the region of $35 billion for the decade 2010 to 2019. And Australians are 5 times more likely to be displaced by a climate-induced disaster than someone living in, say, Europe. So it's a very real problem we're talking of. Water, again, another area that's measured. Australia's water pipe network consists of over 183,000 kilometers of buried pipes. Yet pipe failure is a very common occurrence, and it costs $1.5 billion annually just for pipe maintenance and renewal. So the scale of the problem is the reason why.
Yeah, great. Ben, anything you'd add? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of the things that some of your clients are finding and the organisations you deal with. Anything additional in terms of the kind of importance of environmental intelligence in terms of, I guess, that whole thing of just providing us with better information, informing our decisions better, giving us kind of more real-time data, etc.?
Oh yeah, look, very definitely. Ivan quite comprehensively covered the macro issues with why environmental intelligence is important. From an actual business perspective, it goes directly to the heart of your triple bottom line. It's not just three categories of social, environmental, and financial metrics anymore, which can or may not be related or unrelated. If there is any relationship there, it's generally largely speculative anyway. Environmental intelligence helps people model how those three react as dependent variables as a consequence of any change in your operational initiatives. So it uncovers the actual mechanics of what you do on the ground and how that impacts that, goes toward informing that triple bottom line. And I know there's a number of people who's joined us today with a very strong interest in things like assurance, because when we talk triple bottom line, we're talking assurance. The ability to include insights from what you've learned about how your operations interact with the environment and how your neighbours are impacted. It adds a huge amount of extra depth and new dimension that was not previously visible. So it's, once again, no longer the story of just environmental management being a cost centre that's there purely for compliance and community relations. Your business stakeholders can see the figures on how production was optimised by leveraging your environmental initiatives, using scientifically robust models that are built specifically for particular sites. And we're not just talking reduced numbers of complaints either. We're talking about giving site managers the planning data that they need each shift to continue operations without fear of environmental breaches, which can result in unplanned shutdowns or worse. It basically gives businesses the confidence to plan shifts to operate, knowing what their daily schedule, the daily schedule is optimised to whatever the conditions are going to be coming down the pipe for that shift or that day or that week.
Great. We've talked, more about kind of how environmental intelligence can assist with the things we do today, but I guess there are also some pretty key drivers that are happening around the world, in this part of the country, but also around the world, kind of macro drivers kind of within the industry that are perhaps driving the need for more information, better information, more immediate information. So Ivan, again with the study and the questions that you asked, were there sort of macro trends that you think are driving the need or desire for better information and intelligence at this level today?
Absolutely, Kerry. So I think it's well put when you look at what the author Peter Hinson coined as a term some years ago. He coined the term the new normal. But more recently, he's been talking of the never normal. So post-pandemic, I think that sums up where we are at as industry observers, as private and public sector, as technology developers. The never normal is really the challenge. And if you look at every one of the mega trends that we track, and we're talking of global, long-term, overarching trends that impact the way we live, the way we define success, the way we sort of connect. Urbanization, for example. What are the macro to micro implications of urbanization? Just take population growth and how that creates a burden on infrastructure. So Sydney, for example, Sydney's aviation demand is set to double over the next 20 years. So without any scope to expand at the Kingsford Smith current airport, the expansion has taken the direction of the Western Sydney Airport. But mind you, we are talking of a site that's going to be curfew-free and set in a population hub of 2 million people. So you're talking of noise considerations, flight path considerations, and all of the environmental impacts that will unfold. On the other end of the spectrum, urbanization is a mega trend, but there's also the sub-trend of de-urbanization. We have seen that happening with the whole work from home models and the hybrid work models, where people believe that they can actually work outside cities and still make it work. So that has implications for infrastructure as well. We've seen that in the US, and it's happening in Australia as well. The other megatrend that we track quite a lot is innovating to zero, which is just the vision of a zero world in terms of zero emissions, zero waste, zero defects, zero breaches of security, a lot of different metrics. So if you take an environmental lens to that, fossil carbon dioxide emissions declined, what, 5.4% in 2020, obviously as a result of the shutdowns and the movement restrictions. But the preliminary data for 2021 suggests that there's an immediate rebound in terms of the emissions relative to 2020. So we're talking of a very real risk. If you look at what the World Economic Forum Global Risks Survey plots, climate action failure is the most likely risk facing the globe. It's not infectious diseases, it's not your terrorism, it's not your cyber attacks, it's not weapons of mass destruction, it's not even state collapse, it's climate action failure. So we're talking of a mega trend that is actually taken front and center, not only of the public sector debate, but also private sector. And you're noticing that with the number of shareholder activism developments we are seeing in terms of ESG issues in Australia, and that's going to gain traction even further. And Australia is responding by deploying renewables at what, 10 times faster per capita than the world average. We are rolling out electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure to support electric vehicles as well. You've seen the future fuel strategy, which obviously needs further detail, but it's out there and it's being supported quite significantly by the state governments doing their bit in terms of electric vehicle incentives and policy. Connectivity and convergence, another major mega trend, right? Which looks at leveraging all of the digital tools, whether it is your 5G, cloud computing, mobile devices, AI, big data, IoT, the whole sensorization of our infrastructure assets, right? So when we track that and we look at it from the perspective of infrastructure, one useful metric is to look at what's happening with smart cities. So in 2020, chief digital officers were appointed and were leading digital transformation in cities across the globe. And we know that's happening in London, in Helsinki, Amsterdam, Zurich, Seoul, Hong Kong, New York. And there are more than 180 cities across the globe that have open data portals. So connectivity and convergence is another major mega trend driving the way environmental outcomes are being achieved. Another very important and direct mega trend is that of health, wellness, and well-being. I don't have to go into the health impacts of poor environment, but we've seen what the pandemic has done in terms of straining the healthcare system and exposing lack of capacity. So we don't want to aggravate that situation with poor environmental management. Finally, I'd just like to quickly cover off the other mega trend of government as a catalyst of change. You've seen that in the pandemic, that we as a public, as citizens, have relied on the government as being a data source that we can trust, as being a source of funding, as being a source of policy setting, even a source of sanctions and penalties to influence behavior to minimize disruption of the pandemic. So government initiatives post-pandemic will focus on obviously stimulating economic recovery, and that translates clearly into spending on a range of infrastructure-led construction projects. US Congress has already passed the infrastructure bill, over $1 trillion in federal spending. The Australian government has an infrastructure spend of $110 billion. So very clearly, government as a catalyst of change is a massive driver.
All of those megatrends, I'm sure a lot of the participants today are kind of aware of some of those, but particularly in their own businesses and how they're impacting. And certainly here at the IS Council, a number of those areas around ESG investment, how we accommodate that, respond to that within our rating scheme, the kind of, as you say, the climate change, net zero, as well as climate change adaptation. How do we respond? How do we build infrastructure or secure our infrastructure to ensure a just transition through to the future that we're all aiming towards. But Ben, let me hand over to you around that kind of mega trend. How do you see that at a, I guess, more operational level from an environmental management? What is those mega trends that we're all aware of? How does that kind of translate and impact on environmental management and potentially the opportunity for environmental intelligence?
Well, it's all very much about the confluence of events. As Ivan mentioned, climate change is a massive red flag for everybody. And that is, we're already seeing greater extremes in operational conditions, and it's changing everybody's risk profile from everything from fire risk, dust risk, odour risk, risk of water and rising ocean levels and so on. So there's a change in risk profile. From another thing Ivan mentioned was in relation to the prevalence of social media and connectivity. That's created a massively increased set of community expectations as to what businesses should be doing and what kind of data should be available and how they should be applying it. So that they can understand and manage their environmental footprints. Everything's pretty much exposed, and people talk about problems and issues that they're facing with businesses very openly and very aggressively, and they expect solutions. There's also technological advances now that allow us to do things that even 10 years ago weren't realistic. Things like cloud computing. Now, cloud computing is at a level now that allows us to, at a touch of a button, scale a server up to a supercomputer to customize and run these massive ultra high resolution weather models. And it can be done by a general manager or a site supervisor without having to engage specialists. They can run risk reports to see what is going to be, what the potential risks are from their operations that day or that shift, without having to sit down and execute massive planning tasks beforehand. Plus also the Internet of Things has delivered to us a lot of mobile technology, remote environmental monitors, for example, for dust and odour and noise that are cheap as chips. They're accurate. You can deploy them across large networks. They're powered by the sun, and they communicate over the cellular network. So now people have got access to this huge amount of information that they can actually use to learn about how their operation is impacting the neighbours and impacting the surrounding environment, and then trial different ways very quickly on the fly, if you like, to be able to work out, well, what happens if we change aspect X of our operation this shift or this day. So it's all about how those different factors have come together. I've got a great example of this. I've got a bit of a video here of one of our iron ore loading facility clients, if you'd be able to bring that up, please. We work with a lot of port facilities around Australia for loading dry bulk goods, and traditionally they've had massive dust problems. And what used to be the situation was they would set remote monitors up, these very large, very expensive dust monitors around the perimeter of the operation. And when one would read too high, which was indicating they were breaching their license, they'd have to stop operations. Now, to stop a mine loading facility, it's not cheap, and people tend to get upset. But that was the only option that they used to have. What we're able to do nowadays, and what we're looking at with on the screen, is a highly detailed weather model of an iron ore loading facility that's been animated across the length of a shift. Now, those plumes there indicate where the dust is likely to go from their operations, but it's not just based on weather. We're getting feeds in from their SCADA system so that we know what particular product is going to be in which particular stockpile at what time. We know what the water content is going to be. We know what the dispersion characteristics of those stockpiles are. We know what conveyors are running. We know what reclaimers are running. We know what loaders are running. And we're able to build this picture of what the risk is based on the current shift plan of creating a situation where they would be forced to stop work. So now they know that in advance at the beginning of the shift, and they can go, well, rather than following this particular plan, let's change things, and we can avoid that altogether. So now these loading facilities can run with much less risk of having to down tools and wait until the weather changes, until they feel it's safe again. So that's one example of how that's actually being applied in the real world, and how technology has impacted how these facilities are working. And I think with that, Kerry, we've got a few questions that we just wanted to put out there to the listening audience as well, and we've got a poll question that's appropriate at this point.
Right. Yeah. So just for everybody on the webinar, let me just read out. This is related to that kind of environmental management, and really just kind of asking that question of how environmental management is typically viewed within your organisation. And if you can choose 3 of the options that are there, I'll just go through them. So not relevant or important, it's the cost of doing business, important from a compliance and from an operation license perspective, important from a corporate reputation perspective, helps mitigate operational risks, helps optimize production, it's critical to enabling our growth. So I think these are questions, and Ivan will mention those in a minute, that that came from, you've used before in other studies. So it'll be interesting to see how our audience kind of compares to some of those outputs. So I think we've got all our responses in now, and the results are there for everybody to look at. So Ivan, do you want to make a comment perhaps on the results that have come through from our audience today?
Yeah, very interesting to look at what's emerging here. So clearly, when we did our poll of the global markets, the single most mentioned parameter was importance from a compliance perspective, the operating license perspective. And the second most important was cost of doing business. So I think looking at our audience here, we are looking at an audience that's significantly further down the road in terms of environmental management and intelligence maturity, because what's come up here is really a good thing for the planet, right thing to do. And I also see critical for enabling growth as a significantly mentioned factor. Now, that's very important simply because we are looking at that shift from tick box kind of compliance to seeing it as a growth enabler. And our audience just confirms that.
Brilliant. Well, maybe leading on from that, no doubt this kind of use in more advanced and strategic use, more sophisticated use of information, as Ben's outlined for us, not just from one area, but from multiple areas with overlays. Obviously, that's not something that's kind of generally been used or taken up across the board at this stage. And just be interesting to understand what you are seeing as being the main challenges for business operations to make this sort of shift to a more sophisticated system for managing environmental impacts.
Sure. Well, when you talk about operational change, the first and biggest hurdle is always the human factor. And for environmental intelligence, there's a couple of headline issues that fall under this. First of all, and the main one is awareness. Because a lot of this is technology driven and the technology capabilities are relatively new, the understanding of how this can actually be applied on the ground and the benefits they can deliver is still developing. Now, it was great to see in the responses there that there are people who are using it to optimize operations and to mitigate risk. But there's a lot more behind it, and there's a lot more organisations who are yet to come to that realisation. So what we're finding is that there's a lot of evangelising we need to do, which is what today's all about, really, to let people know what they can do with it. Look, odour monitoring is probably a great example of this as well. If anybody's involved in the waste sector, people are very used to dealing with odour issues by sending our people into the field to take air samples. They're then taken back to the lab, and that gives them a picture of what exactly is in the air at that point in time. So they can say that there's 64 parts per billion of hydrogen sulfide and 72 parts per billion of mercaptans and so on. One of the issues with technology is when it comes online, people start to assume that you should start to replicate the current processes. But that's not the case. That's not the case here, because the reason that we're having the samples are being taken is to determine if there's something in the air that's causing an odour. The underlying problem is that there's a smell in the air. And the people who live near the plants, they don't care how many parts per billion are in there. They just know that something's putting them off their dinner or their breakfast. So what's needed to be put in place are systems that replicate human responses and give the actual answers to the underlying problems that weren't able to be answered previously. So raising that level of awareness of the capabilities of this technology is probably number one. The number two issue, of course, is as with anything with change, it's fear. We find that a lot of people, their first reaction is to be horrified with the level of detail that we can actually uncover about an operation. And they tend to see that as a potential threat. They get scared because they're worried if it's used against them, it could cause them all kinds of trouble. But at the end of the day, this is all about understanding how your business is going to impact your neighbours, how it's going to impact the environment. It's understanding how your changes in operation are going to impact your output. It's how it's going to impact your relationship with the community and with the regulators. It allows you to get ahead of the curve. So arguably, it's much better to get on the bus than cover your face and get run over by it. But it allows you to be very, very proactive. So fear shouldn't be an issue. And I believe we've got another polling question related to this as well, Kerry, that we can put out there.
Great, thanks. Brilliant. So just a question now around your own experience in an organisation of environmental factors. How much have environmental factors impacted your organisation overall in the last 3 years? And this is just choosing one option, so dramatically, in a significant way, somewhat, and negligible, or can't say, don't know. So we're just waiting as those responses are coming up, and I think we've probably got our responses there. So again, Ivan, will I hand over to you to just kind of make a comment on that?
Yeah, Kerry, that's precisely the same kind of split we had in our global survey. So the dramatically and in a significant way responses came up to in the region of around 50% of mentions in the global survey. We've got something like 33 plus 11% here. So I think it is a fair confirmation that we are talking of a very real impact on operations and growth.
Great. So moving on now, sorry, Ben, I just wanted to check. Did you have another slide to show us at this point, or?
We've got we do just for the next
right,
next
around
section.
the benefits.
We've got one last one around the benefits. That's correct.
Oh, brilliant. Yes. So and you know, we've talked a little bit about that already in terms of why EI is important, what the opportunities are, and I think some of the questions that we've got coming in. So just encouraging people to put their questions there as well. But what do you see as the main benefits, and I guess what have people experienced as the benefits of shifting and applying EI to business operations around the kind of management of environmental factors, and as you say, only too rightly, social factors as well?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, the slides we're looking at the moment, I picked this specifically as a very good example to try and illustrate how that works. There's 3 headline benefits that I can talk you through just briefly. There's de-risking, there's resource optimization and cost control, and improved social license to operate. So to help illustrate these, we've got these slides, and this actually shows the end result of employing environmental intelligence at a composting facility. Now, the slide on the left-hand side of the screen is when it indicates when we first launched a full-blown EI platform for this particular organisation. These guys had major dramas with odour, and you can see the counts there indicate the number of a ticket is a complaint, and this is 3 months worth of complaint over summer. It's composting facilities. Naturally, they give off significant odours, and this was really causing dramas for the neighbours. The problem is that a lot of the people running the plant were saying, look, it's not all of us. There are other industries around us that are also generating smells, so we can't be held purely responsible. But if these guys didn't do something about the problem, they were facing being shut down and facing some significant legal action. So what we did is we applied a system here that allowed them to not only track where the complaints were coming from around the facility, but we were also able to model the weather at the time those complaints came in, and we were able to identify how many of those complaints were because of them and how many were not because of them, came from surrounding operations. We were able to identify it was about 25 to 30% of the complaints were not actually their fault. So the news wasn't as bad as it appeared first up, but there was still obviously a major problem. So those additional complaints then, now that they understood that they were responsible for a lot of them, they could actually justify the investing in some quite substantial air scrubbing technology. So what they then did is that they're able to use their EI platform in a very highly granular model of weather model of the surrounds of their operation to work out when they would be likely to be impacting those people to the south. And when the air would be blowing the other way and not causing them problems. They use that to turn on and off the air scrubbing system, and it saved them a bunch of money. Of course, it was an expensive piece of kit to run. So the bottom line in here with the de-risking is that it gives you certainty. You're dealing with objective data. It's not just gut feel. A lot of operations like this, especially if they're small, they tend to rely on people who may have worked at the plant for the last 20 or 30 years to give them advice as to when they should perform specific actions. So there's a whole other aspect here that there's de-risking as well. We're not just using objective data. If those people leave, as they do, you're not losing all of this corporate knowledge that effectively told you when was a good time to perform a certain task. So there's no more gut feel. There's no more oversizing of control measures out either to allow for unknowns. No more concerns about losing the wrong staff. Then there's also cost. These guys, as the example, they know when to turn on and off their odour management systems. In the iron ore facility that we showed you earlier, and for a lot of our mining clients, it's about when they send out the dust trucks, because dust trucks are, fleets are expensive to run, and especially in regional areas, water's expensive, and it's becoming more expensive because of climate change and related factors. So they need to make sure when they are running these control measures, they're doing it when it's needed and not just in case, because they're not sure if there's going to be a problem. So the de-risking impacts the cost as well. And finally, and one of the big things on the triple bottom line is social license to operate. Once you've got all of this data and you can animate it on screen over time, and you can show it on maps, and you can show where a problem started and where it wound up, and probably more importantly, what you're going to do about it, you can show you understand what's causing that problem and you understand how to fix it. This generates an enormous amount of confidence in you from the community and from the regulator, so that you can then go off and we're finding a lot of our clients internationally, especially with things like energy from waste, are using these systems to help get their development applications cleared through the regulator, because the regulator is confident that because they've got these very detailed, very precise models of what's going to happen, that when they say, we've got measures in place that are going to work, they can trust those measures. And the community trusts them when as well. When they say, this is how we've planned it. 6 months down the track, the community's happy because the number of complaints have reduced. And on the right-hand side of the screen there with those, with that maps, you can see that the number of complaints did drop down to, my bar's in the way, I can't read the number. There we go. So it dropped down from over 2,000 complaints to 268 complaints over the course of a summer. That's one's August 2020. The one on the right there is August 2021. So it's been a roaring success for these guys. Still 268 complaints, still a little bit of work to do. But at the end of the day, that's extremely successful. And these guys can continue to operate. The risk of lawsuits has dropped, the regulators off their back, and all is right in the world with this particular composting facility.
Great. It's such a great example to really sort of drive some of that home. And I know in our latest review of the design and as-built scheme, we have at some of the top performance benchmarks talked about real-time monitoring, talked about reporting that publicly to your stakeholders. There's a real increase in our scheme to drive that engagement and communication with stakeholders around issues that are of interest to them from an environmental perspective, as well as community impact, and the ability to be able to communicate, share, keep people informed, give them good information that they can respond to and rely on, and that you can demonstrate improvements. We see as being, these are great opportunities in driving the outcomes that the IS scheme is committed to, and the work that we do within our community. I'm sure a lot of people who are on the call today are also committed to that and interested in that aspect of it. Fantastic. Do we have a last poll?
I believe we do.
Great. Let me just, because I think this kind of comes to the crux of the matter. Some of the other polls were more about the kind of current status, but also really thinking about the topic that we've been talking about today, just really getting a gauge from around the participants. What's the current stage of adoption of digital tools for overall environmental management in your organisation? And if you just choose one of the following: watching and learning, at the planning stage, at the proof of concept stage, deploying next generation solutions already, mid to large scale trials, digital is embedded already into our environmental management, or it's dispersed or siloed adoption. So a number of different opportunities to respond there. And again, thanks everybody. I think Ivan will get you to give one last commentary around the response from this team, and certainly interesting to us because it's an area we're wanting to get a good handle on as well.
Yeah, planning stage did appear as our single most mentioned stage of adoption. We don't have any mention of planning, but watching and learning, it's similar to what we had in our global poll, as well as proof of concept. So I guess it's different stages for different sectors, different sizes of entities. We've noticed that, even different regions.
Fantastic. And this probably just gives me also a chance before we go into questions. I see we've got some coming through, and just encourage anyone who's got additional questions to send those through. We are within the IS Council really wanting to use the digital environment to also drive improvements and efficiency in some of the assurance processes that we use to measure performance benchmarks. And we're really keen to hear from any projects at the moment who might be using some sort of digital facility, whether that's waste tracking or other, that could assist us to perhaps pilot on some projects or learn from you, share some case studies around what you're doing in that space. So anyone on the call who's thinking about using digital platforms or is using digital data already to track some of your environmental outcomes or social outcomes, on your projects or operational assets, we'd be keen to hear from you. So that's my plug, but let's now move on to the questions. We've got a fantastic question here from Monique. Monique would love to hear thoughts on the ability to stimulate or support regenerative efforts using EI. So I guess not just about compliance, not just about the things that we would use to kind of monitor our regulatory compliance using EI systems, but any examples that you have about where organisations or businesses have used an environmental intelligence system to drive enhancements in the environment?
Well, I can make a few comments from in regards to the mining industry for rehabilitating mines. One of the big issues that tends to be faced is with tailings dams, for example. They can dry out, you get dust lifting off, you get all kinds of metals and so on dispersing into the environment. So we have a number of clients who will monitor the old tailings dams to ensure that there's not too much dust lifting off. They know when they need to send out somebody to actually carry out dust mitigation procedures to spray it down, and they can keep track of how that the dust from the tailings dams is impacting the regenerative growth around the actual mine site itself. So that's probably one of the primary ones that I can think of off the top of my head. There's a few to do with estuaries as well, but that's probably the best example I can think of.
Okay, great. Let me move on to the next question, and either of you could pick this up, but any thoughts on the opportunities or barriers to ensure environmental intelligence gained by individual projects or assets or operations is shared within and between industries? And that's from Tom, and that question, I think, is one that, you know, we have conversations often within our organisation too about. Often you might be collecting data, environmental data intelligence for one operation, but the same data could be of value to others within your region, within your community. Is there any thoughts on, as Tom says, the opportunities and the barriers in that space?
I think Ben should be able to sort of comment more specifically about the technological tools. I think things like using cloud solutions is an obvious way to address that pain point, where you have one single source of the truth in terms of a dynamic, updated repository of information that captures all projects and can be shared with different levels of access to different stakeholders. I think that's one of the obvious ways, but I think it comes back to the culture of the organization. And I think that's what Ben alluded to earlier as in the human factors challenge, right? So the tools are great, but you still have to get past the human factors, the general inertia, the resistance to change, the lack of in-house expertise and the kind of fears that are generated as a result of that. So I think the culture comes first, and then obviously some leverage of tools like cloud computing and data repositories that are dynamic.
No, it's very good. Yeah, it's very right, Ivan. The human factor once again kicks into play there. There's certainly a massive amount of potential, Tom, who asked the question, for using that information to build more robust models. The issue, of course, is that we're dealing with a lot of organisations whose operational licenses are tied to very strict compliance guidelines, and it's that information, that data is top secret and needs to be kept. It needs to be kept under wraps. The trick is finding a mechanism that allows it to be allows it to be leveraged without fear, and this is my other roadblock to adoption, without the fear of regulatory intervention causing problems for the organisations who want to get out there and start sharing that data and trying to make the world a better place by using it. So unfortunately, there's no real simple answer there, because that one's firmly with the lawyers, and life is never simple when they get involved, as we know. Look, the desire, I certainly see the desire that with the people that we speak to in our current client base, they want to do that, but there's always that issue of, are you going to get yourself into more trouble than you bargained for by disclosing it without being very careful. The other issue, of course, is also public access to the data. One of the things that's personally affected me actually is noise from a flight path over the where I live in the Gold Coast. I'm near the Gold Coast airport. One of the things that we do as a business, we actually do the flight tracking and noise monitoring for most of the commercial airline airports globally. And when that data was made available with the new landing system that was put in place at the airport, a lot of the public who were opposed to it saw when the flights went over and whether they were impacted by the noise or not. They put their hands up and said, "Oh, look, this was terrible. I was woken up at 4 p.m. by this flight that shouldn't have been going over my house." So you do leave yourself open to other areas of risk. But look, at the end of the day, massive opportunity for it. We've just got to find the right mechanism. I know there's certainly enough people enough of our clients are keen for it. I'm sure we also have clients in the regulatory sector as well, in the government sector, who've expressed their very strong interest in doing that as well. We've just got to find a way of doing it that means people are safe and they don't feel uncomfortable with exposing the nitty-gritty of their operations to the world at large.
Fantastic. And I think I know in our scheme at the moment, under the knowledge sharing, we try to encourage knowledge sharing across our projects. And one of the areas that we have within that is around the sharing of ecological data and the provision of that data that's collected at the project level through to a kind of more national or statewide sort of data repository. And so I can see that, I can see those risks, but also some really clear opportunities, both for better learning, better information, collectively looking to, as Monique said, to restore and regenerate an environment and being more efficient in terms of the way that we're collecting data, only collecting it once, being able to kind of hold that and share it so that we can drive the outcomes that we're looking to drive, but also, understanding that there are some risks with that. We also, in a number of our credits, really encourage the and reward the public reporting of information across environmental, social, cultural and economic factors on a project. And the more that information is, it's always scary to, well, it's initially scary, that's my experience of sharing some of this information at an organisational level with the public. But, if you're on a pathway for improvement, if you're looking to demonstrate the positive impacts that you have, if you're wanting to build, as Ben said earlier, that social license to operate, you want to build trusted relationships with your community, then being open about the data that and the realities of the data and information and the impacts that you're having, as well as some of the positive impacts that you're having. Just one final kind of question from me, really, and we have touched on it already, but I'd love any even blue sky thinking around this in terms of that really important relationship with stakeholders. There's such an opportunity, I think, with environmental intelligence to increase all of our understandings of the real impacts that we're having on the environment and of the opportunities to developing those relationships with our community, to developing not just ourselves providing that, but also from a kind of community science perspective. You know, there are community groups out there too who are wanting to participate and contribute to betterment in our environmental areas. So just anything finally around examples that you might have, or where you see the opportunity, maybe more at that level, to really use environmental intelligence to drive improved outcomes at a societal stakeholder level.
Yeah, I think the example of new product development that's happening globally, it has moved from a very closed, highly confidential, competitive kind of approach to a very open collaboration approach of product development. You're seeing new products crowdsourced across the community. We've had P&G produce new products that have become bestsellers just by throwing it open to the community to actually solve problems that their customers are facing. The same kind of analogy could very well apply here, though I don't have any real examples of it happening, but it could very well apply here because the benefits of open collaboration are significant and far outweigh any potential risks in terms of competitive threats.
That's great, Ivan. And I think, certainly at the IS Council, collaboration is one of our values, our community of practice, people who are participating here today. We're keen as much as possible to kind of share those stories. Ben, any last thoughts from you on that particular topic?
Look, yeah, there is. Thanks, Kerry. Because as Ivan said, the potential there for collaboration is huge, and a lot of the majority of people who are impacted by environmental issues are the residents of cities and towns. With the technological advances that we've got now in terms of the Internet of Things and low-cost sensors, you can actually buy air quality monitors and weather stations for less than $100 that you can pop up in your own house, and that transmits to the web. And there are some companies out there starting to do this already. They haven't taken off so much in Australia, but there are a few in the US and Europe who are gathering all of this information and showing broad-scale patterns across entire cities and in entire states, in the case of Europe, entire countries. When you take that information and you combine it with data that you gather from major industry players, from government regulators, you start to develop a massively powerful data set that you can get research institutes at universities starting to dig in and start data mining and ask questions that haven't been thought of yet. So but we've got this combination of very low-cost consumer grade environmental monitoring technology, and we combine that with very detailed models of how industry is impacting the environment, and bringing all of that together in one central repository. We've got a tool then that we can use for all manner of things. So I'm quite excited about what the next 5 years holds for us in that respect.
Great. Well, I think on that very big vision, big and exciting vision, I'd just like to thank Ben and Ivan for your conversation today. It's been insightful. I'm sure those attending have really enjoyed it, and thanks to people for their questions. Thanks to all of those who came along, and also to those in the background who have helped to put today's session together. This is a really important topic for us to consider, to understand how we can use it more effectively to drive environmental, cultural and social benefits. So thanks again to everyone who participated today, allowed us to have this great conversation. Stay safe, everybody, and go well for the rest of the year and into the new year. Thanks so much. And one last thing, there's a survey that'll be coming your way at the end of the webinar, so we'd really appreciate everyone completing that survey as they exit. Thanks so much. Cheers.